You might have seen some headlines recently about China dumping US assets. According to the US Department of Treasury, Chinese investors offloaded 21.2 billion US dollars of US assets in the month of August, the most in 4 years. $21 billion is a lot of money. So in this video, I want to talk about why Chinese investors in the Chinese government might be dumping US assets and explain how this could affect the future. There are two ways this is being reported. The US narrative is China's economy is collapsing and therefore investors need money to prop up the renminbi. While there might be some truth to that, I think it misses the bigger geopolitical reasons for dumping US assets, which is the second way only a few people are reporting on. We all know that many in the US have been calling for a Chinese economic collapse for years. So I don't think there is much value in focusing on that aspect, especially when China hits GDP growth numbers each year that would make many Americans cry. So let's talk more about the geopolitical reasons why China and Chinese investors might be pulling out of the US. The US and China have been frenemies for a long time now, and we all know that. But in recent years, the US has dropped the friends part and are actively calling China the enemy. In this clip that I'm about to show you, it is clear the US is no longer willing to work with China.
We know who our enemies are. Not just Hamas and Hezbollah, but a regime in Iran that chants death to America. An authoritarian Russia and a Chinese Communist Party whose stated goal is to defeat the United States at every turn.
The clip clearly shows how the US is moving forward with legislation that is targeting Chinese companies. This bill will force Syngenta to divert its land holdings in Arkansas. The language used in this press statement is wild. Governor Sarah Sanders and the others that spoke call China the enemy and are actively looking to block or remove Chinese companies and investors from Arkansas.
Today, we are becoming the first state in the country to take an action like the one that we are announcing right now. At the beginning of my term, my administration worked with our partners in the legislature to get hostile foreign entities out of Arkansas. I was proud to sign Act 636, sponsored by Senator Johnson and Representative Vaught, banning foreign parties from 9 enemy countries from owning agricultural land in Arkansas. And today, we are acting on that law. I'm announcing that Syngenta, a Chinese state-owned agrochemical company, must give up its land holdings in Arkansas.
This is just one example of dozens that are currently taking place around the US and in Washington. The American Compete Acts, commonly referred to as the Anti-China Act, is another good example of how the US is no longer willing to work with Chinese investors and how the US is looking to block or stop China from competing in the US or on the global stage. The bill is worth reading, and I would suggest everyone at least read the key points, but one of the many interesting aspects on the bill is to fund anti-China media. You might be asking yourself, what does this bill and funding anti-China media have to do with $21 billion of US assets being dumped by Chinese investors? Basically, the way I see this is more and more Chinese investors are seeing the US as a bad investment. If you aren't forced out and fined by governors like Sarah Sanders, you definitely aren't going to be welcomed as a Chinese investor in the US. On top of general investments like land and stocks, which you might be forced to sell, or it might be seized like in Russia's case, the US Treasury bills aren't as safe as they used to be. There are several important reasons for why US Treasury bills look less attractive. The 10-year US Treasury yield recently hit 5%, and bond yields and bond prices move in opposite directions. So the rising yield means that the demand for treasury bonds is falling. When a central bank raises interest rates, your treasury bond yields increase, and this in turn makes the bonds prices decrease. With trillions of dollars worth of US debt sitting on China's books, there is no reason to hold on to it in this current environment, which is why China and other nations are incentivized to sell in order to mitigate the risk of taking a loss in the near future, right? If the yields keep going up, then countries might lose money. Foreign countries are aware that the United States economy is not as strong as it used to be, and the government is always on the verge of shutting down, which could lead to a default. If you are an investor, this makes you really think twice on whether or not you want to invest in the US, because there is risk there. When a government issues massive amounts of debt, it has to pay interest on it, and as the US Treasury yield increases, it means the government has to keep paying that interest to all of the bond holders, which becomes a major burden on the US economy. We all know that the US currently cannot default because they can just print more money. But the problem is the United States government has been running deficits forever, and that debt will scare off some investors that are unwilling to finance the US lifestyle in the future. If the US keeps printing money, it will continue to devalue the dollar, making a 10-year or 30-year T-bill useless if it ever gets repaid. It is also too risky to hold when the future is too uncertain, especially if you can find other investments or opportunities. All this means is that China is no longer willing to fund the US military that is looking to engage with literally everyone and anyone, and that is parked on the borders of China. When countries like China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia buy IOUs from the United States in the form of T-bills, the US takes that money and funds wars around the globe. This was working well enough because it created some stability and allowed for international trade, but with a more aggressive US, especially towards China, it makes no sense for China to fund its own invasion by the US. I suspect to see more and more international investors shying away from the US because the US government is making it too risky, especially for Chinese investors. It is kind of like having an abusive neighbor that is always asking you for money. You might give the money at the start because it makes sense and it makes things easier. But when your neighbor starts buying missile launchers and pointing them at your house, it makes no sense to give him more money next time he asks. Divesting early before a conflict breaks out makes sense. China learned from what happened to Russia, Afghanistan, and other nations that had their assets seized by the US. I always support peace, but I'm not stupid, or at least I try not to be stupid. So from a geopolitical standpoint, it only makes sense for Chinese investors and the Chinese government to divest from a nation that is calling you its enemy. What do you guys think? Will we see more decoupling and divesting between the US and China? Can it be stopped? Should it be stopped? Leave a comment below and let me know what you think about this growing divestment. Also, if you're looking for another video to watch about China, you might like this one here. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos in the future. I'll see you in the next one.